The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison slammed his gavel. "Mr. Patterson, you owe $47,000 in back taxes. Pay immediately or face foreclosure." The elderly man's weathered hands trembled as he clutched his worn hat. "Your Honor, I served this country for 30 years. Surely there's some consideration." The judge's cold eyes showed no mercy. "Military service doesn't exempt you from financial obligations. Case closed. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where we explore the moments that restore our faith in humanity and remind us that heroes walk among us every day. Sometimes they wear uniforms, sometimes they don't, but they all share one thing in common: the courage to stand up when it matters most. Today's story takes us to a small-town courthouse where an injustice was about to unfold, until one man's 7 words changed everything. Let's uncover what really happened on that fateful Tuesday morning that would become the talk of the entire county for years to come. George Patterson had dedicated his entire adult life to serving his country. At 18, he enlisted in the Army during the Vietnam War era, driven by a sense of duty that ran deeper than fear. He spent 3 decades in uniform, rising through the ranks not through politics or connections, but through sheer determination and unwavering integrity. His service record was impeccable: 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and countless commendations for bravery under fire. When George finally retired at 48, he thought his battles were over. He settled in the quiet town of Millbrook with his wife Sarah, purchasing a modest home with his military pension and savings. They lived simply but happily, with George volunteering at the local VA hospital and Sarah teaching at the elementary school. Their life was peaceful until Sarah's cancer diagnosis changed everything. The medical bills began piling up immediately. Sarah's insurance covered the basics, but experimental treatments and specialist consultations drained their savings quickly. George sold everything of value: his medals, his car, even his wedding ring, to pay for treatments that might give his beloved wife a few more precious months. When Sarah passed away 3 years later, George was left not only heartbroken, but financially devastated. The tax bills had been accumulating during Sarah's illness. George had requested extensions, explaining his circumstances to the county office repeatedly, but bureaucracy showed no compassion. Late fees compounded the original debt until it became an insurmountable mountain. At 71 years old, George faced losing the only home he had left, the place where he and Sarah had shared their happiest memories. That morning in Judge Harrison's courtroom, George stood alone. He had no lawyer. He couldn't afford one. He had no family. Sarah had been his only family. He had no advocates, or so he thought. The courtroom was nearly empty, except for a few court officials and one man sitting quietly in the back row, wearing a crisp military uniform adorned with stars that indicated his high rank. Judge Harrison was known throughout the county for his harsh sentences and complete lack of empathy. He had built his reputation on being tough on everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Politicians praised him for his no-nonsense approach, but those who had faced him in court knew the truth. He was a man who had forgotten what compassion meant. "Mr. Patterson," the judge continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "I've heard sob stories like yours 1,000 times. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone thinks they deserve special treatment. The law is the law, and you will comply or face the consequences." George's voice was barely above a whisper as he tried one last time. "Your Honor, I gave everything to this country. I lost friends in combat. I served in places most people can't even pronounce, and I came home to serve my community. My wife died fighting cancer while I fought to pay for her treatments. Isn't there some program, some veterans assistance that might help?" The judge's response was swift and brutal. "Your military service ended decades ago. What you did then has no bearing on your current financial irresponsibility. You had 3 years to resolve this matter. I'm ordering immediate foreclosure proceedings. Sheriff, please escort Mr. Patterson out and post the notice on his property today." The words hit George like physical blows. He swayed slightly, his face draining of color. This was it. He would lose everything. The home where Sarah had laughed, where they had planned their retirement, where her presence still lingered in every room. He would become homeless at 71, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. That's when the man in the back row stood up. His movement was deliberate and commanding, causing everyone in the courtroom to turn and look. He was tall and imposing, his uniform impeccable, his bearing unmistakably military. The stars on his shoulders caught the courtroom lights as he walked down the center aisle with measured steps. "Your Honor." The general's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Judge Harrison looked up, clearly irritated by this interruption to his proceedings. "This is highly irregular. Who are you, and what is your business in my courtroom?" The general reached the front of the courtroom and stood beside George, placing a gentle but protective hand on the older man's shoulder. "I am General Marcus Webb, United States Army. I've been listening to these proceedings, and I believe there are some facts that need to be presented to this court." Judge Harrison's expression shifted slightly. Even he recognized the implications of having a high-ranking military officer in his courtroom. "General, while I respect your rank, this is a civil matter involving unpaid taxes. Unless you have legal standing in this case, I must ask you to be seated." The general's eyes never left the judge's face. His voice remained calm, but carried an undertone of steel that made everyone in the courtroom hold their breath. "Your Honor, before you proceed with this foreclosure, I believe you should know exactly who George Patterson is and what he has done for this country." The general reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder that he had clearly prepared in advance. "Mr. Patterson served with distinction in Vietnam, where he saved the lives of 12 soldiers during a particularly brutal engagement. He was wounded twice in the line of duty, but refused evacuation until his men were safe. After Vietnam, he served in training roles, molding young soldiers and preparing them for the challenges they would face in defense of our nation." George looked up at the general with surprise and gratitude, but the general wasn't finished. He opened the folder and began reading from documents that detailed George's service record. During his 30-year career, Sergeant Major Patterson trained over 3,000 soldiers. Many of those soldiers went on to serve with honor in subsequent conflicts. Some of them are now serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, carrying forward the lessons he taught them. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but the general pressed on. After his retirement, Mr. Patterson volunteered countless hours at the VA hospital, comforting wounded veterans and helping them navigate the often confusing maze of veterans' benefits. He organized fundraisers for families of fallen soldiers and personally counseled veterans struggling with PTSD and other service-related issues. The courtroom had become completely silent, except for the general's voice. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the power of his words. When his wife became ill, Mr. Patterson exhausted every resource he had trying to save her life. He sold his medals earned through blood and sacrifice, to pay for her medical treatments. Those medals represented a lifetime of service to this country, but he gave them up without hesitation for the woman he loved. Judge Harrison's face had begun to show the first signs of uncertainty. The general noticed this shift and continued with renewed intensity. "Your Honor, the law you're so eager to enforce exists because of men like George Patterson. The freedom you enjoy, the safety you take for granted, the very system of justice you represent, all of it exists because men like him were willing to sacrifice everything to defend it." The general paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what would become the most remembered moment of that day. He looked directly at Judge Harrison, his voice clear and unwavering, and spoke 7 words that would echo through that courtroom and beyond for years to come. "He served so you could sit there." The silence that followed was deafening. Those 7 words carried the weight of decades of service, sacrifice, and dedication. They held within them the truth that many people forget, that the freedoms we enjoy come at a cost, and that cost is paid by people like George Patterson, who ask for nothing in return except the chance to live with dignity. Judge Harrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, discomfort, and finally something that might have been shame. The general wasn't finished, though. He reached into his folder again and withdrew another document. Your Honor, I've taken the liberty of researching the county's Veterans Assistance programs. There are several options available to Mr. Patterson that apparently weren't offered to him during previous proceedings. The general handed the document to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. Additionally, I've contacted several veterans organizations who are prepared to provide immediate financial assistance to resolve this matter. The American Legion, the VFW, and the Disabled American Veterans have all pledged support. Mr. Patterson will not lose his home today, but the general had one more surprise. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a checkbook. Furthermore, I am personally prepared to cover the entire amount owed, including all fees and penalties. Consider it a small repayment for the debt this nation owes to Sergeant Major Patterson. George's eyes filled with tears as he looked at this stranger who had appeared like an angel in his darkest hour. General, I can't let you do that. I don't even know you. Why would you help me? The general's stern expression softened for the first time that day. Actually, Mr. Patterson, you do know me. You just don't remember. 38 years ago, you were my drill instructor at Fort Benning. You were tough as nails, but you cared about every soldier under your command. You taught us that honor isn't just about following orders. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Recognition dawned in George's eyes as he studied the general's face, trying to see the young recruit he had trained decades earlier. The general smiled. You probably trained thousands of soldiers and can't remember them all, but I remember you. You changed my life, Sergeant Major. You taught me what it meant to be a soldier, and more importantly, what it meant to be a man. Judge Harrison had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort. The entire courtroom had witnessed his callous treatment of a war hero, and now a distinguished general had not only called him out, but had also offered to solve the problem he had been unwilling to address with compassion. The judge cleared his throat and spoke in a much quieter voice than before. Mr. Patterson, in light of the new information presented to this court, I am prepared to postpone these proceedings while we explore the veterans' assistance options that the general has brought to our attention. The general shook his head. Your Honor, with respect, postponement isn't necessary. I meant what I said. I'm writing a check right now for the full amount. He began filling out the check with steady hands while speaking to George. Sergeant Major, you gave me direction when I was lost, purpose when I was confused, and strength when I was weak. This is the least I can do to repay that debt. As the general handed the completed check to the court clerk, he turned back to Judge Harrison. Your Honor, I hope that in the future, when veterans appear in your courtroom, you'll remember that their service has earned them at least the courtesy of compassion. They've already paid their dues to this country in ways that most of us never will. The judge nodded, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. Yes, General, I understand. George was overwhelmed with emotion, struggling to find words adequate to express his gratitude. General Webb, I don't know how to thank you. This kindness, this generosity, it's more than I ever expected from anyone. The general placed both hands on George's shoulders and looked him directly in the eyes. Sergeant Major, you don't need to thank me. You need to keep doing what you've always done, serving your community and helping other veterans. That's thanks enough. As they left the courtroom together, the general shared more memories from his training days under George's command. He told stories of lessons learned and challenges overcome, painting a picture of a drill instructor who was tough but fair, demanding but caring. It became clear that George's influence had shaped not just the general's military career, but his entire approach to life and leadership. The story of what happened in that courtroom spread quickly through Millbrook and beyond. Local newspapers picked up the story, then regional outlets, and eventually national news organizations. The image of a distinguished general standing up for a forgotten veteran resonated with people across the country. It reminded everyone that heroes come in many forms and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but in everyday moments when someone chooses to do what's right. George Patterson kept his home and continued his volunteer work at the VA hospital with renewed energy and purpose. The general's act of kindness had not only solved his immediate problem, but had also restored his faith in the goodness of people. He began sharing his story with other veterans, not to seek sympathy, but to remind them that their service mattered and that there were still people who remembered and cared. General Webb's 7 words became something of a legend in military circles. "He served so you could sit there" became a rallying cry for veteran advocates and a reminder to all of us about the sacrifices made on our behalf. The general himself continued his distinguished career, eventually retiring with full honors, but he always said that helping George Patterson was one of the most important things he ever did. Judge Harrison, for his part, underwent a quiet transformation. He began working with local veterans organizations to ensure that service members facing legal difficulties were connected with appropriate resources. He never spoke publicly about what happened that day in his courtroom, but his actions afterward showed that the general's words had found their mark. This story reminds us that gratitude isn't just a feeling, it's an action. It's not enough to say we support our veterans, we must show that support when it matters most. The general could have walked away from that courtroom, telling himself that it wasn't his problem or his responsibility. Instead, he chose to act, to stand up for someone who had once stood up for him. In our daily lives, we encounter opportunities to show gratitude and compassion to those who have served us in various ways. Teachers who shaped our minds, mentors who guided our careers, friends who supported us through difficult times. They all deserve recognition and support when they need it most. We may not all have the resources to write a check for $47,000, but we all have the ability to speak up, to advocate, and to show that we remember and care. The true power of this story lies not just in the dramatic moment when the general silenced the judge with 7 words, but in the reminder that every act of service, no matter how small, creates ripples that can last for decades. George Patterson probably never imagined that a young recruit he trained in the 1970s would one day appear in a courtroom to save his home. But that's exactly what happened, because kindness and dedication have a way of coming back when we need them most. So the next time you encounter someone who has served others, whether in the military, in education, in healthcare, or in any other capacity, remember George Patterson and General Webb. Remember that saying thank you is important, but being ready to act when thanks are needed most is what truly matters. Because somewhere out there, someone who once helped you might need your help in return, and when that moment comes, you'll have the chance to prove that gratitude is more than just words. It's a way of life.